So during this coronavirus, what has changed about the way you've been consuming information or spending your time for somebody that's so self-directed and was already doing online distance learning? How much has your life changed?
Honestly, because I have been remote working in some sense for the last 2 years, I would say a lot less than the average person, although in general, I've sort of been made aware of how much I value just having a structure and sort of like just general sort of rituals around everything that I'm doing every day, because it really sets apart each part of the day. And so that's been really nice. I've also been walking a lot, walking and reading at the same time, which you can get really good at really fast. That's been quite enjoyable.
So do you do that with a book or with your phone, or how do you walk and read? Explain how you learn to do that. You
definitely need a book. I would say a book, you just gotta make sure you're walking on relatively flat ground. Phone is too hard. Phone, it's gotta be a book.
And you've been doing this, like, would you say you've walked and read a mile?
Yeah, I accidentally walked 10 miles the other day. I showed up near my friend's house and I was like, I did not realize that this much, 10 miles would get me this far in Virginia, but it was exciting. I got distracted by my book.
What did you read for 10 miles? That's a totally different way to mark time.
Yeah. I was reading the history of Western science, which is something that I've been very interested in recently, which is like, how do we think about the bubbles of sort of like rationality and science and also religion now? Like, do those things overlap? Should they overlap? Why or why shouldn't they? And that question throughout history, which it turns out a lot of people have been asking for a long time, which is why it's helpful to read this sort of thing. So I've been enjoying that a lot.
What have been some of the discoveries out of that book? I mean, because I think like right now in this exact moment, what a book to be reading, because there is very, very few people have any answers at all. So you end up having faith in one story or another. The coronavirus is terrible, masks are what we need, or coronavirus is nothing, we don't need masks, but people are putting their faith in a story.
Yeah, that's true. There's been a lot of, just in the 13th century there, which is, where I was reading on the 10 miles in that point in history. There's just a lot of discussion between the church and Aristotle and his teachings of like how things in the universe come into play, just people going back and forth. And the church was like, we should take science with open arms. Science often proves our claims of faith, proves like Christianity largely. And some people would say, okay, you're not practicing philosophy correctly, and you're not practicing your faith correctly if those two don't align. It was like another big interesting movement, and some big theologians at the time agreed and some disagreed, but yeah, it's just it's a timeless question, and it's cool to hear people thinking about the same thing in only a slightly different way thousands of years ago. I
went to a Jesuit university, Marquette, and I way undervalued the logic, like the liberal arts part of it until much later. But I do remember in our philosophy classes taught by a priest that if philosophy and theology come into conflict, so long as the philosophy follows the fundamentals of logic, then you have to question your theology, because the philosophy is used as the mathematics to understand the logical arguments of the Bible. And that if they come into conflict under Jesuit teaching, it's not to say you just throw out the faith, but it's to say you've probably hit on something that is an incongruity with the way you understand God, as opposed to the laws of logic and philosophy are broken.
Yeah, I'm so interested in that question. I think it's super hard, even just in terms of like, if you look at the wideness of the way Christianity has been practiced throughout history, even currently, I have, a very limited exposure to majority sort of like East Coast Protestant culture. And luckily I went to a school where I got to talk to a lot of Orthodox people, honestly, a lot of atheist people surprisingly at a Christian school. But there's just such a Christianity in Africa, and the way that like sort of a spirituality is more highly valued there, and aesthetics are more highly valued in Orthodoxy. I think a lot of times it's also easy to like put your own beliefs into logic, surprisingly, right? Logic should be immune from that. But I think I've recently realized how much my own like religious education was centered around how can we prove these things out? How can we study apologetics and all these other things to perfectly argue our points in a way that nobody else can argue with them. And in reality, it's just a very difficult balance.
You said orthodoxy has an aesthetic. I've never thought of it that way, right? Like when I think of orthodoxy, I think like, oh, those are the people that wear the all black robes or the all white robes. But as I'm thinking about more of the orthodox, you're right. The ornateness with which they can do things maybe is because they're so singularly focused on one domain and aren't trying to please all people.
Yeah. And just, I really admire, Eastern Orthodoxy. In general, it's prominent in Orthodoxy, the idea that we should be worshiping with our entire body, basically. And so all of your senses, it should be an experience that occupies all of your senses, whether that's your smell and like just all sorts of things. You're smelling, you're hearing in different ways that aren't just singing worship music. And for me, I think that's super compelling. I think that should be a more prominent part of those churches.
You were mentioning Africa or like this is what I was thinking of as you were talking about some of the spirituality. So I lived in Kenya for a while, and it wasn't until I came back from there and I started studying culture from, a more objective standpoint. And they talked about a concept called monochronic and polychronic time, which is depending on what type of culture you're in, how do you view the way that you spend time? So in a capitalistic, industrialized culture, we have monochronic time. Like everybody shows up at 8 a.m. to do what they're supposed to do. And then when you're done at 5, you go home. If you're talking with somebody like you and I are talking and our meeting time is up at 5:30, you understand if I'm like, hey, I got to go talk to this other person. However, in polychronic time, which, you sometimes think of as like island time, you have this concept where people are much more relationship focused and they're all about the experience going on right now. So if you then came to me and said, hey, Vance, it's 5:30, I got to go, I would be like, what? You don't value this relationship at all. So taking an industrialized mindset and dropping it into polychronic time, it makes you almost explode because you can't handle the fact that it seems like everyone is rejecting you.
Yeah, I've never heard the explicit words before, but that makes so much sense. I'm like, some of my friends who've been like either visiting family in the Middle East or living there for a while said it's just, the way if you are interested in spending time with somebody else, they are going to like, go all out for that sort of like interpersonal relationship is very valuable, but also like whatever time limits you set often are thrown out the window. It's like, just we are having a great time together, and that could go until like 3 a.m. in the night because we're enjoying each other's presence. The time here is not the most important thing, which also, I love that. Honestly, more people in the US should be like that.
For me, it was like unnerving, right? Because here I am trying to be the good Peace Corps volunteer that's sitting and happy with like what the culture is going on. But at the exact same time, I have this Swiss watch going off in my head about the things that I'm missing and like how things aren't working. And I think about this in the context of church. And for me, I was not in the moment because before we went to church, I'd be like, well, how long does this last? And they'd be like 2 hours. And I'd be like, all right, start the clock, right? Instead of being like, I'm in this experience and I can have it all envelop around me. And really it gave me a sense of eventually you have to just give into it, because if you fight it all the time, all you are is angry. And now in the current world, so I am not religious, but I grew up Catholic. And I decided this year, like, hey, I want to know what is it that I just rejected and thought out of hand, hey, that's silly, those stories, the whole Catholic tradition. So I'm going to go to church and I'm going to try and observe it in the same way that I did when I was in Africa, where I am curious about all the things I don't understand instead of just going through the motions. And I find it to be a good exercise to try, but extremely difficult to be present in a service that I've seen 1,000 times, which is the Catholic Mass.
I totally understand that. It's like I've had the very similar challenge where going through Christian education from the time I was in kindergarten, where like your Bible class is something that happens every day and chapel happens every week, whereas like a 6-year-old, you're singing hymns and